with some.
Hello, my name is Bas Jacobs.
My name is Akiem.
Together with 2/3 of Underware, there's a third guy at home doing the work now. Say hello to Sami. And we're very, very happy to present you a new font. It's called Dewars. And we want to explain a little bit the process behind the font, how it came to life.
Dewars is like a monolinear script, and basically we have 4 weights and 3 different styles. And here you can see a quick overview. And the idea was that the different styles of the font, they are representing different writing tools. So, for example, a marker or a brush or a broad nib. And there's 3 different weights. So that's the thin style. There's also round style. That's regular. Black. And whenever we design a font, we try to define in the beginning a very clear concept, what this font makes it different with the other fonts we designed. And for Dewars, one basic concept was speed.
So it's a handwriting font, and what you have with handwriting, the basis factor, or the factor which has the biggest influence is the speed of writing. So if you look at the speed, let's call Roman inscriptions, let's call it writing for the moment, maybe it's drawing, but let's ignore this. It's a very slow form of writing, very formal, and then on the other side of the spectrum there's a shopping note or something like very fast, informal, the most informal kind of handwriting you can imagine. We made a couple of scripts once before, Bello and Lisa, and they were both a little bit on the left side of the spectrum, like very controlled, rather formal scripts. And the challenge was now to make a script with very high speed and then still see if we can maintain a certain style throughout the whole font or throughout the whole family.
And of course, if you make a font which is based on speed, you should also have like contextual forms, so that it really looks like it's quickly written by hand. And to achieve that, we actually build in like different and contextual cheese-up features. And because we only have 30 minutes, we just want to explain one very quickly. That's what we call the T-topper.
And for this, we only explain the TT topper. So what happens if you have 2 T's next to each other in a script font? The way to make this is just to test it in very, very many different contexts. So we have one context, it's called the word billet, and it would be nice if this TT would have 1 stroke. So if you have this word, it's super logical, TT, 1 stroke. But what you would do with handwriting, if billet would not be billet, but if it would be another word, then maybe pirouette has much more space on top on the left side. So maybe the stroke would go up and go a little bit more to the left. So you make some TT ligatures which goes on top to the left. And then if this looks better already, but if pirouette changes to quintet, then there's a problem. There's a 30 which you actually want to include in this ligature. And you have to find a solution for this as well. So there's many, many different kind of solutions. Problems which you have to find a solution for, and the only way to do this is to test this. So you have the problem with this T, you have the problem with the Y, you have the problem with all the other situations, and you test them one by one. Like this is one sheet with test words, but then there's not one sheet, there's hundreds of sheets which you have to check. And this is just only for the TT ligature. So it gives you a little bit of a clue why we work a couple of years on a font family before it's finished.
Another important aspect by a monolinear font is, of course, the skeleton. Like when you design a font like that, I think it's normal that you start with a kind of skeleton. And it's interesting to see like what's actually the origin of the skeleton. Like in the very beginning of digital typography, people made vector fonts consisting just out of a single stroke. And therefore, I think at the moment we are still very much focused on the idea if we want to make a monolinear font, we just take a skeleton and we expand it. And that's how we work in most cases. That's also how the font tools are working. They, like for example, if you're in RoboFont or in Glyphs, they provide you the tools to do that very quickly. But at the same time, you could also consider like going the other way and try to use an existing font and see if you can extract a skeleton from that. And then, of course, like some things are very simple, very clear. Others are not so very clear, like how to get the skeleton out of that. And again, I think at the end it's possible, and then you have to use something called brunning, which is kind of abstraction and also assumptions that you define a skeleton within a form. And it's quite interesting that basically this option to extract a skeleton from an existing typeface, it's not built in any design software, like not Illustrator. And so to do that, you have to download like a little application, and then actually through the terminal, you can just use your font, like for example here, Lisa.
This is a script typeface we made before, which is not based on a skeleton, and where we try to see if we can just...
And just to see like what would happen if you would then actually extract the skeleton, that's just done by the script, and then you would, for example, put it in Illustrator, and there we have this so-called vector brushes, and then we can apply the vector brush on the skeleton, and if you then zoom in, it looks quite interesting.
Color
surprising.
Fonts. It's color fonts.
It's all based on vectors. And the next important thing, of course, if you work with skeleton is expansion. And of course, like if it looks monolinear, it's of course not like everywhere the same width. And especially if you have different weights in your family, you have like to do different things for different weights. So you cannot just have like a one interpolation, but you have to make like a special exception glyphs for complicated forms.
So once you have a skeleton, you can do many things with the skeleton, and you give something. So you give us something to play with. So we start to play with it, and you can apply certain strokes to it, which could be interesting. Everybody knows this font, Reporter, and it has this very interesting beginnings and endings of the strokes, like a brush stroke. So we thought like maybe we can try the same, apply this to a skeleton, and introduce some brush beginnings and brush endings.
And yeah, of course, you don't want to do this all manually, so you try to write a script, and you apply the script to your first fonts, and then you see what's actually happening, and you do it to all glyphs, and then you discover like little mistakes which are appearing here. And so basically you start to explore like how is a brush like actually constructed? How does this work, and how does like a brush end relate with the rest of the form? Like how does it come out of the stroke? And to simulate that, we then made a little extension for RoboFont. And with this, the nice thing is that you can actually see in real time what the different parameters do to the form. Because basically in the beginning you cannot imagine how it will look like. You only have like parameters which you define. And then while dragging there, you have to see like what's actually happening. And then you find out like what you need, like how is the brush actually constructed. Like there's this kind of checks, and the checks, they have a certain width, and the width, they have a certain roundness. And then there is a certain randomness between all those checks. And so while working with this extension, you find out more how those strokes actually should look like and how they should be designed. And then, of course, by reporter, what we just saw, there's also those strokes in between the long strokes. So we also try out stuff like that, like cut out elements and see if you can make a stroke which is really connecting the two loose ends of this letter form.
I think there was some discussion on this conference before if designing should be separated from programming or production, or I think it's in the end all the same thing. Like you cannot separate one from the other. You cannot give this to a program and tell them like make me this and then continue design or finish the design. Like it's all part of the design process.
So at the end we compared our result again with the reporter, and there's basically two different digital versions. At least we could find two different versions, which little bit like the second one has like open forms in the middle of the strokes. But then if you look even further, you will find another font called Cursiva Rossignol. And the interesting thing here is that you see that there is a kind of direction in the strokes, if you look very carefully, which is not so present in the reporter font.
Also made by Carlos Winko, same designer, who just a couple of years after he made reporter, he continued working on reporter, said like, I can do this better.
So if you look at the strokes there, you can see, like here, for example, you could define a direction. And then if we compare this again with our tool, we see like, oh shit, so the tool is not good enough because it can only go one direction. So you have to extend it to make it both directions. And then only then you can achieve a result like that.
So now you can have complete control on the beginning of the stroke, how the brush should look like, and on the end of the stroke, how the brush should look like.
Whenever you make fonts, you of course like consider like which software should I use, which program should I use, and I think this question people ask themselves especially now because everybody is like talking about this variable fonts. And
we do.
But perhaps the most important question about this is not making variable fonts, but perhaps making fonts variable, which is probably something totally different. And so let's do a quick example. If people use with the variable font, if people work with variable fonts on the internet, they have their files, their HTML, CSS, and the variable font. They send it to the browser, and then the browser checks like, okay, can I support this variable font? If yes, it's just taking it and basically renders the website. And meanwhile, like not all the browsers support variable fonts, so there's an intermediate solution for that. If the browser does not support it, people make like scripts which generates like intermediate fonts from the variable font, which are then used to render the website.
Still looks the same. So if it still looks the same, what's the problem then with variable fonts? There are a couple of problems.
Yeah, the thing is, of course, it all depends what you want to do, like how you want to make your font variable. Like if this is what you want, then your masters will look probably something like this, and then you get like a problem with the interpolation, because in the variable font there's like only linear interpolation, and so we have to do something else which actually makes this what we want to have. And so when we try to make this Dewars like a variable in that way, we again like went back to a rubber font, and there we made a little tool which actually allowed us to define kind of keyframes in the skeleton which was based for designing the font.
So the aim is here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make an animated font. A font which builds up by itself in steps, and if you put all the steps behind each other, you get an animated font.
And for us, it was important that we needed to define those keyframes very carefully because we wanted to have as natural as possible written typeface. So again, we had this tool, and there you see like how the font is then constructed. And on the left, you see actually the animation, how it will look like, and how it will like how the dynamic works of this of the writing.
So this is an attempt to make an animated font based on the skeleton, and with still full control over the outlines, because that's important. You don't want to change the outlines.
But then again, it was quite lots of work to define all those keyframes for every single glyph. And then at the end, if you can explain what you're doing, there's always also a possibility to put it in a script. So basically, the much smarter solution is just to define a script and to define like a basic parameter of a main speed and a kind of a relative speed. And then you would just see like what's actually happening when you write with a pen. The relative speed is defined first of all by the direction. Like if I go down, I write much quicker than if I go up, for example. Or if I go up left, it's the most slowest. And the second parameter is probably the amount of curvature. The more I go around the curve, the slower I get. So once we have the script, we can actually just keep our fonts as they are. We don't need a skeleton anymore. And the script will just do all the extra points which are required to generate all the glyphs to make the animation. So no matter how much we want to have, like if we want to have a very, very smooth animation, we need like lots of points. And there you can see that when it goes up, it's lots of points because we are slow. And then we are going down, there's less points. So animated, it looks like this. And with that, with this script and this basic font file, we can do actually something like this. We don't need the variable font anymore. We just have our script and the basic font file. And then everything what we need is actually generated in the browser of the user. And then we get this. And for the user, it's also very simple to achieve that because the user, like the designer, has to communicate with with our font that he wants to have it written. So there's a little plugin, a little JavaScript plugin, and you define your text, and you load the plugin, and basically just like write it. And depends on what parameter you define, you can also write it, for example, on the top, it's like written from the left to the right. Or in the middle, it's more like written everything at the same moment.
One of the advantages, it's still a font. You can still select this text. You can Google can still find it in a search engine. You can still make a PDF out of it. You can still copy-paste it. So it's still a text. You can use it dynamically in your WordPress blog. It's still like any other font, but then animated.
When we were working at the font, we also read this book from Gerrit Notzai, The Start from the Cat, The Tale of the Cat. And there he writes about about reading, like about how kids learn to read. And that's very interesting. Like he says that when the teacher learns the kids to read, she has to explain like that the order of the letters, they actually matter. Like if you have the left, this means cat, like
in Dutch.
In Dutch. Yeah. And if you like rotate the two letters, like the first letter gets the last and the last gets the first, it gets a different meaning. It's like tak, which is Dutch for branch. So the teacher at the school teaches the kids like take care of the order of things because this changes the meaning of everything. So the next day, when the teacher goes to the kids and says, like, yeah, what's this? Then they say, like, yeah, of course, this is the cat. So the kids are like, okay, the cat, this is this tail left and head right. So when she asks, what's that? The kids say, of course, that's tak. And this, like, that the order of things matter. There's also this very famous example of Led Zeppelin, and there people discovered like if you play Led Zeppelin Stairway to Heaven reversed, you get like a satanic lyrics, which sounds like this. Let me see.
So there's a second language in the song which we didn't know. It's a new language.
And then a Dutch artist got very obsessed by this idea that there's a second language which we don't know yet. So what he did is he learned the second language and recorded the song again. So here's the making of. So he's singing the word, the Stairway to Heaven backwards. So there's lots of discussion about if this is really done on purpose or not. And so there's also a film where the band, like Robert Plant, is asked, like, tell us, what is it?
Well, I struggle with some of the lyrics from particular periods of time, and I don't know, the musicality and the construction of it is it's peerless. But maybe I didn't quite feel the same about the lyrics a little bit later on in life as I got a bit further down the road. Maybe I'm still trying to work out what I was talking about. Every other fucker is. I mean...
So still, we don't know, like, what the whole song is about. Again, the normal lyrics, it's very, also very unclear. So let's listen again to Jeroen Offermans, but now again, like, reversed, so it's correct this time.
There's a sign on the wall, but she has to be sure, 'cause you know sometimes words have two meanings.
So at least we know words have two meanings. That's what we still understand.
And we think we found out what's the real logic behind the lyrics. We all know that Led Zeppelin took a lot of drugs then. And when we designed the font, also at a certain moment somebody said, like, a script becomes real when it gets unreadable. Like, there we are again with a note, like what we write for our shopping list. So we were wondering, like, what happens if we design, like, characters which are unclear on purpose, which can be on purpose be read in two ways.
Or three, or four, in many ways.
So here are the first sketches, and then we designed those letters, which we call polyletters, and it's like polysemantic letters. So this on the right, for example, on the top row is an A and an H at the same time. And here's a whole alphabet of polytype. And
No, basically, when you have these polyletters, you have a new way of communicating. Like, it offers you maybe a new language, new visual language. So what you have with spoken language, that you can say something and then probably the other person understands something else. The same you can have with written language, if you have the right tools for it. So if you have hate, maybe it's not very far from love. You can easily still also put it in a variable font.
But now we come back to Led Zeppelin again. So they were singing about, like, a word with two meanings, and it makes me wonder.
Basically, we still don't know what he was talking about. He also does self-remember what he was talking about. But we figured it out, I think.
So what we think is that basically the whole lyrics of Stairway to Heaven was written in a truck trip. And in this trip, he saw this word at the wall. And could not understand, like, what is it? What do I see there? What is written there at the wall? And of course, like, at a certain moment, he's like, yeah, I can read it. And then I looked at it again, so like, oh shit, yeah, I can read it. So basically, the whole Stairway to Heaven lyric is about the between heaven and hell, and it's about this, that he saw this polysemantic typography in his drug trip.
So we finally have this also in the font. It makes it very hard for you to work with, because where do you get all this? So this is, for example, a tool. It's a writing tool. You just a text editor, you can write, and then as soon as you write a word, you get some suggestions what this word could also mean if you use the right font for it, or the right glyphs. So maybe Led Zeppelin should use this text editor to write their fonts, to write their song text. And of course, so it says your look is erotic, but maybe it's Arctic, or Arctic is the same as erotic, like we don't know. And of course, you can also make a whole dictionary out of it to make it more easier to look up words, and the dictionary is endless, of course.
Okay, the end of the presentation, we want to talk about, like, what is actually a font?
Now, what is a font? Of what is a font?
What is a font?
What is a font?
And yeah, if you look from an objective point of view, I think a font is always the typification of language. It's a kind of abstraction, and it's a kind of abstraction where we try to actually translate what we say into language.
So we have the system of, we just invented a system for this, very simple. The alphabet, 26 letters mostly, for the most things.
So we can pronounce this in 20,000 different ways, but still it's like only like the same word still written. And this abstraction of language, of course, we have now at the moment 26 letters, but yeah, we could also perhaps make it just with 3, or even just 1.
You could still read it.
But at the same moment, you can also ask yourself, like, if type is like basically based on the abstraction of language, perhaps you can also go the other way around and try to extend it again, the abstraction. And probably that is what this is about. So with every font, basically there's 3 aspects. There's like the aspect of the type designer who's designing the font. And then there's the designer who's using the font and the consumer who's reading the font. And probably with every font which is designed, this relates with all those 3 aspects. And with Dewars, I think it's like, with the type design, it's more like this, the font itself with this alternate glyphs and the design itself. And for the designer, it's more like the tool to make messages being written. And for the consumer, there's this aspect also with polywords. But probably if you do if you make a different font, all those 3 things will also be different.
Stop.
Tusind tak.
Stop.